the three of us are here to talk about ghosts. When I was a boy, my mind was very much taken up with thoughts of ghosts and haunted houses. I grew up in a rather old house and was consumed by night fears of one kind or another. The dark at the top of the stairs, what those creaking sounds in the attic might signify, that terrible face, clearly discernible in our garish 1970s wallpaper, looking out at me in a malignant way. And I was oddly drawn to all of that stuff, despite being terrified or mortified by it all. And one of the things that stayed in my mind is a famous photograph. It's not this one. It's a photograph which I couldn't stop thinking about as a child, and I'll show you this. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that what I'm going to show here is a genuine photograph of a ghost. There's a huge amount of literature dedicated to showing that it's a fake, a hoax, a double exposure, just an accident of some photographic process. Other people have defended it. Here's the photo. This is called the Chinnery photograph. It's taken on March 22nd, 1959 in Suffolk, in England. Mabel Chinnery, who took the photograph, and her husband had just visited her mother's grave, and she took a photograph of her husband sitting alone in the car. When the film was developed, she was surprised to see another figure who she identified as her dead mother sitting in the back of the car. You can see this. Here's Chinnery's husband, and there's this face here with light reflecting off her glasses. Now, the reason why I start with this image is that for a great number of people, this is the sort of thing that might support the belief that there is a life after death. It's worth noting, you see, that we started this series with depictions of different models of the afterlife. Survival of the disembodied soul, resurrection of the body, reincarnation, with a survey of differing destinations, heaven, hell, purgatory. Very well. But we also want to know why it might be reasonable to believe in the survival of the individual personality after death, what evidence one might piece together in support of such a belief, and so on. Now, there are a number of sources of support that one could gather here. One might say, more philosophically, with thinkers such as Plato and Descartes, that the soul simply cannot be destroyed. Only physical things, material things, can be destroyed or broken apart. The soul is non-physical and thus by nature immortal. We find arguments of this kind in Plato's Republic, in Descartes' Discourse on Method. Now, another less argumentative, more immediate source of support lies in the phenomenon of near-death experiences. Those vivid experiences that a considerable number of people have reported upon being resuscitated, say, during a surgical procedure. And report things like an experience of floating above the body while flatlining, entering a dark tunnel, finding themselves in something like an idyllic garden, being reunited with departed loved ones, and so on, before being snapped back into the body. Now, such near-death experiences are suggestive of the possibility of a continuation of some kind of immaterial life after the death of the body. Ghostly or spectral encounters might also be suggestive of that possibility. And in this photo, perhaps, the departed mother of Mabel Chinnery may be attempting to communicate in some fashion with her daughter. And reported encounters with ghosts are not at all uncommon. According to one opinion poll, 18% of Americans report having seen or experienced in some fashion a ghost. That's quite a large number, of course, 18% of the population. Now, one should, of course, make a couple of preliminary points. Firstly, we're not obliged to simply accept all those reports of ghostly encounters. That would be very foolish. People can be mistaken, deceived under the influence of drink or illness. And perhaps a large number of ghostly experiences can be dismissed in that manner. It would, however, be dogmatic and willful to dismiss all such encounters and reports. The numbers are too great. The extent of the experiences throughout the centuries and across cultures too striking. The true question is, what are these things that people report and what might they signify? And that brings us to our second preliminary point, which is that we need to achieve some kind of clarity regarding what is meant by the word ghost. Now, a ghost is typically defined as an apparition of a dead person or the spirit of a dead person appearing to a living person. Now, I do have to say that such a definition may not possess any clear meaning at all. Thomas Hobbes, in his great book, Leviathan, warns us against a type of word or expression of which we can, he says, conceive nothing but the sound. These are words which are commonly used, but which seem to have no clear or intelligible referent. So there are words that are used, and we say them a lot, but we can't really get clear about what they are. They seem unintelligible to Hobbes. And the word ghost or spirit of a dead person may be examples of what Hobbes means here. We talk very glibly about the spirit of a dead person, but it's actually hard to pin down what that could possibly mean. We conceive the sound, but we have no idea of the referent. And even if things aren't as dramatically bad as that, the term ghost does seem to cover an enormous variety of disparate phenomena that may not possess any unity. To this end, I want to utilize, adapt, and augment the taxonomy of ghosts provided by Roger Clark in a very interesting recent book called A Natural History of Ghosts. Clark's taxonomy is itself built upon another list provided by Peter Underwood, a researcher into the paranormal. Well, we have a variety of ghosts here, or things that are called ghosts, but very, very different things. First of all, we have poltergeists. This is a picture taken from the haunting known as the Enfield poltergeist. Enfield's a part of London. There are lots of photographs taken purporting to show poltergeist-type activity. Note the picture of David's soul up here. People can just jump around, of course, but it was supposed to be indicative of this particular terrifying set of activities. Now, the activity of a poltergeist, the word poltergeist coming, of course, from the German word meaning noisy spirit, Geist, spirit, ghost, mind, and so on, is typically centered upon a family, usually upon a teenager. The house is under siege by a host of alarming and unpleasant supernatural phenomena. There are loud noises, furniture's thrown around, sometimes people are thrown around, and so on. So that's our first type, the poltergeist. We then have what he calls a traditional ghost. This is a picture, of course, from an illustrated version of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. A traditional ghost is straightforward enough. I suppose it's the kind of the archetypal ghost. Souls of the dead, aware of the living, able to interact with them. Now, these things are found more in fiction than in real life, and the Christmas Carol is the prime case of such a story. Though you can also think about Hamlet's father, and the whole of Hamlet is built upon this encounter with the ghost. A third kind, this is what Clark calls mental imprint manifestations. These are ghostly figures and apparitions that repeat an unchanging scene over and over again. For example, opening a door, walking across a room, walking down a staircase, and so on. Now, such apparitions often appear on important anniversaries. Some of these ghosts are of very famous people. Lady Jane Grey was the shortest reigning British monarch who reigned for only 9 days before she was beheaded. And she was beheaded at the Tower of London, and people witness this spectral form of Lady Jane Grey walking towards the site of her execution on the anniversary of her death. Now, there's an interesting variety of this case in the matter of ghostly battles. This is a representation of the Battle of Edgehill, which took place in 1643 during the English Civil War. 500 men died at Edgehill. And on a number of occasions after the battle, local shepherds reported seeing another battle at the same spot. They heard screams, the neighing of horses, saw the gun smoke, the thundering cavalry, and then the whole tableau just vanished. I mean, first of all, they thought that there was another battle taking place, but then it just vanishes. King Charles I took this matter of this ghostly haunting of the battle very seriously. Not that did him much good. He took it as a good omen. It wasn't a good omen. But he sent a team, interestingly, Charles sent a team of investigators back to Edgehill to look into the haunting. This is one of the first examples of a Royal Commission spectral investigation. We'll return to the meaning of this haunting shortly. Next category is referred to as a crisis apparition. In the case of crisis apparitions, this is when someone sees a close friend or a family member at the point of that other person's death. This photograph is somewhat related to that. It was taken on the 5th of December 1891 by a woman who had been staying at Combermere Hall in Cheshire, England. And when she developed the plate, she was surprised to see the outline of an elderly man here, sitting in this. There's a look of scepticism here. This
students in the room, what do you make of it?
The man was identified as Lord Combermere himself, but Combermere, when this photograph was taken, was already dead, and was at the moment when the photograph was being taken, he was being buried a few miles away. In our next category, we go beyond the nature of human ghosts. Here we have animal apparitions. Ghosts do not appear to be confined to humans. We read from time to time of phantom dogs or of horses. This picture purports to show a phantom dog. There it is. This was taken in 1916 in Buckingham by a retired police inspector. There was reportedly no dog in the frame when the photo was taken, so he was surprised to see this. And finally, our category goes to phantoms of inanimate objects. Ghost lore is full of stories of ghostly coaches, ghost ships. I love this picture, in fact. This is a portrayal of the Flying Dutchman, the most famous of all ghost ships. The Flying Dutchman was doomed to sail the open seas forever, never being able to return home. Fans of Wagner's operas will know this story well, of course. So this is our category then of these set of ghost types. And what might this tell us specifically about the prospect of an afterlife? Well, I suppose we should say that if we're looking for reassurance about the survival of the individual personality after death, then only a couple of these categories seem directly to help us. In the case of traditional ghosts or crisis apparitions, an argument might be made that these really are the souls of dead folk trying to communicate with the living, settling some unfinished business or whatever. Now, this becomes a far smaller number then. And we'd have to examine each of those cases very closely and see whether there is a better explanation than that a ghost, the soul of some dead person, has really been encountered. Here we'd need to look into the state of mind of the person reporting the encounter, the conditions under which they saw this thing, and so on and so forth. Only then could we draw a conclusion over whether a spirit had possibly been encountered, or whether as Gertrude says to Hamlet, this is the very coinage of your brain. This is a great line. That instead of thinking that the ghost is something out there, it's something to do with the trauma of the person seeing it, or what they want to see. But this relates to these traditional ghosts and crisis apparitions. The majority of ghostly phenomena, I think, seem to be of the mental imprint type. If you stay in this room at this motel, you will see at a particular point a woman walk across the floor to a window, she'll stand there and weep. It's like the Hotel del Coronado has something like this going on, I think. This seems to me, though, it's more like a recording of some kind of event than a soul trapped somewhere in a sentient, conscious state. Indeed, there's an entire theory that stresses that ghostly phenomena arise when an extreme situation, an execution, say, or a battle, or some extreme state of mind, grief or anguish, leaves a mark or, in some mysterious way, scars some specific place. And this theory became known famously as the stone tape theory. The idea is that hauntings are something like tape or video recordings, and that emotional or traumatic events can be recorded, albeit in some mysterious fashion, onto stones and other items, and can subsequently be replayed under certain conditions. There's a certain kind of appeal here. Intuitively, we feel that an old house, one that's witnessed or accumulated a lot of trauma, a house in which people have died, is a better candidate for having haunted status than a newly constructed unit in a high-rise tower of condominiums. That's why I'll only live in very, very new places. Now, this is because something terrible has been in some way recorded in these old houses. I don't know. It's an interesting idea, I suppose, though the mechanism of how ghost recordings happen has not been clearly explained. Maybe it's an entirely confused notion. Pieces of stone don't seem to have the same properties as audio tape or videotape. So it might be just a network of conceptual confusions involved here. Maybe the best thing we can say here is that sightings of ghosts, while not proving the existence of an afterlife, nonetheless might weaken one's sense that the physical world is all that exists. We may not be able to say anything concrete or positive about ghosts, what they are, how they arise, but ghostly encounters might indicate that there is a realm of something else, something as of yet unexplainable. And if that is the case, then who's really to say that bodily death might be the end of a person's life? Now, while we're on the subject of the shaking and weakening of materialistic belief, it might be worth saying a word about the concept of the uncanny. I'll just do this very, very quickly. The locus classicus here is Freud's great essay on the subject, simply called The Uncanny. I recommend it to everybody. Freud there explores the uncanny as a particular species of the frightening, a slow, creeping sense of dread. And this uncanny feeling, he says, is produced by a seemingly disparate array of things. And there's a number of the things that Freud talks about, they're very, very different phenomena, but they're all, he thinks, evocative of the uncanny. The idea of dismemberment, the idea of the double or the doppelganger, curious coincidences, the reappearance during the day of a certain number, for example, the feeling of déjà vu, the impression produced by certain lifelike dolls, mannequins, or automata, and, in line with this, uncertainty over whether an apparently lifeless doll might actually be alive, and of course, perfectly for our purposes here, hauntings, haunted houses, and ghosts. Freud famously sees the connecting link in all of these phenomena to lie in what he calls the return of the repressed. Sometimes this is to do with the repression, the forgetting of individual childhood complexes. Freud uses this notion to explain, for example, the uncanniness of automata. And he explains it by saying that in our childhood we played with toys and dolls, talked to them, gave them a life, thought they were alive in some way. And then when we see a doll that seems to hover on the boundary between the inanimate and the animate, and here's within the history of art, this great image, this Hans Bellmer's image of the doll. It's a curiously uncanny image. That childhood feeling, Freud thinks, is sort of resuscitated. it returns. And here arises that sense of the uncanny, a feeling of both familiarity and unfamiliarity. And with regard to the uncanny impression produced by stories of ghosts and hauntings, Freud stresses a different kind of repression. There's two kinds of repression at work in the uncanny, I think. Individual childhood repression and that kind of collective repression of worldviews that have been surmounted. And in this case of surmounted worldviews, left behind worldviews, the uncanny reveals an older collective worldview, in the case of ghosts, in which our ancestors habitually believed in spirits. A crucial passage runs like this. It's a great picture of Freud. It says, we, or our primitive forefathers, once believed that these possibilities were realities, he's meaning ghosts, and were convinced that they actually happened. Nowadays, we no longer believe in them. We have surmounted these modes of thought, but we do not feel quite sure of our new beliefs. And the old ones still exist within us, ready to seize upon any confirmation. As soon as something actually happens in our lives, which seems to confirm the old discarded beliefs, we get a feeling of the uncanny. It is as though we were making a judgment, something like this. So the dead do live on and appear on the scene of their former activities. So the uncanny for Freud is always a marker of the fact that we're not fully into the scientific realm. We feel we're there, but we're unsure of its correctness. Encounters with ghosts, either direct or reported, so it's not just that you see one, but you hear a story, or even if you read something fictional that really grabs hold of you, that shakes our sense of confidence in our new scientific worldview and immerse us atavistically in an ancient view, an ancient world long thought gone, and that brings a sense of disorientation and dread. I mean, the master of this stuff in fiction is M.R. James, greatest of all ghost story writers, and the premises of M.R. James's stories are always some pompous professorial type who doesn't believe in anything and dismisses the whole idea of ghosts, and then finds himself in an old hotel at midnight and something terrible always happens, and he's like, oh no, I was wrong. So we can note here then distinct ways in which the idea of the ghost conflicts with a worldview informed by science. It rocks our confidence in that new worldview, producing a sense of uncanniness. Or perhaps it leaves us with the thought that there are uncharted realms beyond this world. And accordingly, it can leave us with a hope in the possibility of some kind of life to come. And with that, I'm going to shift territory over to Professor Karapetian. It's all yours.
This is not a photograph. This is a photograph of a painting. This is Sir Joshua Reynolds' Sarah Siddons and the Tragic Muse. And you'll see behind Sarah Siddons that there are indeed a couple of spirits. And I've always loved this painting. When I was a kid, I used to draw it. It was at the Huntington in Pasadena. And I would go and just sit there and draw it, as opposed to Pinky and Blue Boy, who were in the room as well. There was something about the kind of drama of this inner dialogue she was having with these spirits that never kind of suggested the question of whether or not they existed. Because they did. For her, they existed. The tragic muse was real. But no one actually wonders whether or not those demons were behind her while the painting was being made. And that's like a turn of thought that recurs so frequently in the difference between painting and photography that that's what I'm going to talk about today. These are Victorian ghost photographs. And of course, from the moment they began to be created, people were concerned about their veracity. Why do we care if these pictures happened, and we don't care about if, the reality of the presence of these spirits? What is it about the photograph that kind of is so close to our actual experience of life that we both really want to believe it and can't? There was a period in the 19th century, which I'll kind of build up to as I cycle back into history through these pictures, when spirit photography was very popular in England and America, and a little bit in Japan. And people commissioned these, people happened upon them, people then accordingly, in cyclical fashion, debunked them. Some of them, different photographers had different styles. So in this case, there's more of a kind of a melange of presences behind these people, and there are in these a bit more of a restrained relationship kind of implied between each sitter and some particular person of importance in their lives. And of course, any photo student in the room knows that you can make these, right? You can double expose, you can long exposure. The person could have gotten their hands on a negative of these other people. There are plenty of ways to debunk them, but it kind of, the point that I'll keep returning to is, does it matter? These people really needed these photographs to be real at the time. And essentially, the kind of construct that you'll see throughout the history of photography since its actual inception is that all photographs are ghosts, and that the afterlife is the province of the living, as we kind of contend with this knowledge that essentially we will not only all die, but that people in our lives, experiences, places, people, things, are all fleeting. And that before the invention of photography, of course, the way people dealt with this was through any variety of kinds of memento mori. There were death masks, sculptural death masks, which I won't picture in here. There were relics, pieces of hair, all kinds of woodcuts. But the moment that photography was invented was a particular moment at which people knew that something was sitting on the other side of the camera, and that therefore the referent, the thing depicted, as Roland Barthes would come to say, the referent adhered. People believed in the thing on the other side of the camera, however staged, however manipulated, it existed one way or another at some time. And so it began to really very closely model the relationship that we have with our own processes of grieving. And so the photograph became something that was really important, that still is really important in death processes, grieving processes, and the process that we live and process as the living. So Roland Barthes, for those of you who have read who's read Camera Lucida, a few people in the room, he wrote this book 2 years after his mother's death and 2 months before his own, when he got hit by a laundry van. And I have read it for 20 years for various reasons, as a student and as a professor, and I've always read it as the ontology of photography, the essential characteristics of the photograph, that in part 2 happens upon the death of his mother. But after my own father died this last year, I was rereading it and realizing that essentially his mother died, and potentially he's not using her as an example of the ontology of photography. Perhaps, in fact, he was using the pursuit of the ontology of the photograph as a justification for looking at pictures of his mother. He defers the discussion of his mother until part 2 of the book, which is a very coy way of suggesting that's not his intention, that's not the thrust of the book. But I'm more and more convinced that writing this book and figuring out the ontology of photography was, in fact, a ruse for, for spending time with photographs, for the afterlife of his mother. He opens the book, though, not talking about her. He opens the book by says, "I'm looking at eyes that looked at the emperor." And he's talking about a photograph of Napoleon's brother. And he can't get over the fact that he's looking at a photograph of the brother of the emperor, and that this person, though dead, also looked at another dead person, Napoleon. And that there's something about the photograph and the fact of that actual existence of a person on the other side of the photograph that makes this depiction different from any other painting, any other kind of depiction that might represent the emperor. He doesn't understand what that means, and his friends don't seem to care about this picture in the same way. So he goes on to begin to unpack what is different about the photograph. And he gets to this point where he's looking at pictures of his mother, and he's looking through all of these pictures, and none of them actually capture her essence. None of them are her ghost for him. He's lived with his mother his entire life. Until she died, he called her his inner law, just like Andy Warhol living with his mom. And he says, "I would have recognized her among thousands of other women in these pictures, but I could not find her." And this is really disappointing for him until finally he does happen on a photograph of her that kind of works for him, that he feels like represents the essential characteristics of this woman who's been so important to him. And this is part of his way of kind of unpacking what my students will be reading soon about how certain photographs have impact and certain others don't. The studium of the photograph being the subject of the photograph, the punctum being the thing that wounds, the thing that pricks, things that make something recognizable and distinct from other images. So he has taken a number of different photographs in the book to unpack this, but three of them, the one of the emperor, the one of his mother, which he doesn't include in the book, and this picture, he uses specifically to talk about death. In all of the other pictures, he's talked about the punctum as a detail, like you can think of a photograph of a soldier having been wounded, and maybe the studium of the picture is the soldier has been in war and has been wounded, but the punctum is like that his cigarette's still in his hand or something. So it's a detail of the picture that makes it stand out. In this picture of the man who had recently tried to assassinate the Secretary of State, waiting in his cell to be put to death, the punctum becomes not a detail of his incarceration, but the fact that he's going to die. So for Roland Barthes, throughout this book, death is a very present part of not only parsing photographs, but his own impetus for doing so. Every photograph, he says, is this particular catastrophe, that either the subject is going to die or already has. So it's not quite the same thing as my kind of initial contention that all photographs are ghosts, and that in fact ghosts, whether or not you think they exist, do exist, that the afterlife, whether or not you think it exists, does exist as a part of our process of processing death. So to back up a little bit, in the 19th century, photography was invented, and immediately photographs began to be used as part of this processing of the fact of death. Daguerreotypes were taken of children, and daguerreotypes were a mirrored surface, are a mirrored surface, if you've ever seen one or made one. They have a very kind of a mirrored surface. And so when you're looking at a photograph of a dead loved one, you actually also are able to see yourself. And moving forward from this period of memento mori, these objects, these relics that people would have kept about a dead loved one, they encapsulated the daguerreotype in these beautiful little velvet set boxes, gilded boxes, and so it retained this status of object. This was such a popular phenomenon at the time that there were, I think, 3 death photographs to every marriage photograph that were made at the time. And these great little circulars with which photographers learned how to make photographs and communicated about what they were doing, since there were no institutions, no schools, no museums to talk about it. These circulars included a lot of kind of narratives from these long-winded, basically social media posting, isolated photographers about these experiences of having hearses pull up at their studios and like everybody jumping out of the hearse and saying, look, get him before rigor mortis. And they bring them into the, and he says, the undertaker comes in, displaces the coffin, takes off the lid. The remains were those of a bright-looking youth of at least 16 years of age. Death had spared a naturally handsome face, or if he had dallied with its features at all, had added to it an expression of sweetness but seldom seen in life. So he runs with him into his glass room, which is this kind of atelier that the photographers tried to have with Northern Light, and tries to get a picture of him. By the 60s, though, the 1860s, this kind of photograph of the dead had changed, and with the invention of wet collodion and calotypes, it was a little bit more portable. Photographers would be asked to go into people's homes and photograph the dead as part of the family. So the girl on the left down there is dead, the girl in the middle up there is dead. And since these are fairly long exposures, the dead person often actually appears, better than the live people So this is a very interesting period of reanimation. And then suddenly spiritualism starts to kind of fade, and they stop photographing the dead people themselves and start photographing performances of grief. So the dead people stop being present in the photographs. Instead, widows weep into handkerchiefs, and parents look at photographs for the first time, exhibiting a performance of how they're processing the death of their family members. And by the 1890s, it's moved past even that and become more of an obligation. So these cards were made at funerals of the coffin and sent out as notices, and so this is kind of more of a social courtesy. But throughout this entire period, you've got these spirit photographs. These seem just really funny to us now, or they do to me. This kind of staged, Halloween scene over here, and this woman who, through some kind of triple exposure, probably has now a veil, even though they must have had to find 3 different negatives to make this work. But my skepticism aside, I have to honor the fact that these were meaningful as objects, and that despite debunking, people needed them just as much as they needed, this kind of socially obligatory photograph. After the turn of the century, Kodak has popularized the camera. It's become more widely available. People are taking their own pictures. And the wars begin to affect people all over the world. I'm making up this narrative and conflating a lot of events, but people stop wanting to photograph their dead, per se, and they start wanting photographs to appear even less and less manipulated, and more what we call the straight photograph. So you have fine art beginning to incorporate methods of reportage, and in fact reportage becomes basically the thrust of the first 40 years of the newly minted photo department at the Museum of Modern Art. And yet, even as with this photograph, the Spanish Civil War, the first photograph people really discuss as a photograph of the moment of death, people are constantly trying to debunk it. They don't do that with Goya. Nobody tries to say this guy's sword was a little bit higher, and that guy, maybe there's some discussion in art historical circles, but there is a lot of discussion about whether or not this person was dying, whether or not this was anywhere near the battlefield. There is a whole other set negative of another person dying in this exact same spot, and so they assume that to some extent this is a fake photograph. And yet it's one of the most famous photographs from the Spanish Civil War, and Robert Capa is greatly, Time magazine calls it 100, one of the 100 greatest photographs. And regardless of any of that esteem, it's a moment of death which people are obsessed. So again, returning to the idea that it doesn't matter maybe whether or not it's true, it's still potentially a potent image in the way that this is a potent image. It's still a ghost, or a way in which we might contend with the idea of death. So now to transition from the history of photography to some of its more, the history of photography of death to some of its more kind of contemporary social deployments. Obviously we use photographs to deal with death all the time. David Bowie's death, you see not only the mural and the flowers, but photographs of Bowie, people photographing the photographs, and the painting of Bowie. There's this kind of constant need to reassert the body through this sticky medium of photography in which the referent adheres. And you see this across cultures. So in Japanese shrines, you'll see, in the Kamidama, you'll see photographs of the deceased. In African, Dutch waxcloth prints, you'll see portrait photographs worn and then turn into items of clothing that include pictures of the deceased. This is Mandela. It's totally not a death cloth, but I couldn't find one on the internet. And in fact, there are many families in West Africa will print photographs of family members who have died and put them on cloth to then turn into outfits. In Russia, as Putin began to kind of foster this sense of make America great again, Russia style, around the Great Patriotic War, which is their term for World War II, individual citizens began to use photographs in what they called the Immortal Regiment, a parade of their dead, since millions and millions of Russians had died in that war, and they wanted to kind of counteract the dominant narrative of the government. Eventually, as you see on the right, that really personal deployment of photographs around death was co-opted by the government, and now is not only co-opted by the government, but also by corporate entities who put out these special frames and have redefined the orange and black ribbon as significant towards mobilizing culture around this idea of the great USSR and Stalin, in fact. In Israel, you'll see people putting photographs on the grave sites of soldiers, even though you're not supposed to put photographs in Jewish burial sites, because, again, they're trying to counter a dominant narrative about what happened to or with or involving their dead. And in Argentina, you'll see mass marches of people holding photographs of the desaparecidos, the people who were disappeared and therefore obviously at some point died under a particular regime. So just to close with what we do with this as photo students in a fine art program, how do you handle the fact that death is so closely related to the photograph, both on a kind of a sociological level, and a vernacular level, and on this kind of existential level with which we need to contend with our mortality. There are a lot of ways in which artists have turned to the photograph and its vernacular deployment in order to translate ideas of death and ghosts, not only of people but of periods. And so there's just like 3 examples or something. We've got Lorna Simpson using photo booth pictures from the 40s as well as drawings from the 40s. And her intention in kind of using photographs from the 40s was not only to suggest that these individual people's lives had ended, but that the era of Jim Crow was also an important moment to which to refer. We have Tessa Dean, again, staying really, really close to vernacular photography, so close, in fact, that these are all pictures she's just collected from flea markets and deployed without text in a book called Flow. Not necessarily on purpose to remind of mortality, but definitely does. All of Tessa Dean's work is, in fact, kind of anachronistic in that way, but especially that book. Gerhard Richter I'm including here, even though he's not a photographer, because his work, especially in this case, really contends with vernacular photographs. And what do you do as art students to kind of translate the pictures you're seeing and their place in your life? This is Uncle Rudy and Sailors from his work in the 60s, where he's just painting from family photographs. Isn't your feeling when you look at these one of knowing, as Bart had pointed out, that these are catastrophic photographs insofar as they refer to a person who is certainly dead by the time it's painted and by the time we look at it again, re-represented. I threw Mario Giacomelli in here because I love him, but also because this work, When Death Comes, It Will Have Your Eyes, is a really kind of moving way of using kind of emotive printing processes to describe an emotive state. So he's gone into a hospice and he's photographing these elderly in various states of demise. And there's a lot of love in the photographs, there's a lot of death in the photographs, there's a lot of sickness in the photographs, but they're all printed with this kind of energy of life. Susan Sontag said that life is a film and death is a photograph. And when you look at these, you might get a sense of the conflation of the two, that there's both life and death in every photograph, just as there is in every ghost. Flores Noises, this is a photogram of a body on a chair, and when deployed, this is the artwork, the chair on top of the photograph. So this is actually an installation shot of a work that involves a photogram on the floor. It's called Be Right Back in German, and of course reminds me of a ghost. And I wanted to kind of suggest that since all of these pictures, vernacular or retranslated through fine art, are not so much about ghosts, but about an act of looking for a loved one who has gone. Another process which was just an exercise for me, I'll include, which was one negative I made of my father when he was alive, just from an iPhone picture, and I couldn't stop printing it, but only with a little chemistry kind of thrown on here and there. And so you would see like just a bit of his neck, you know, just his like Adam's apple. Sometimes you'd find an ear, sometimes you'd find nothing. Sometimes you'd get a little bit more of him. And these were all just kind of accidental deployments of chemistry that would, you know, kind of allow for bits and pieces of the image that was exposed totally on the paper to appear. And that was kind of one way in which I was contending with death last year, just this looking, and the idea that if death is not a loss but a robbery, and that you in fact don't know what you're missing until you have kind of reached for it and it's not there, that photography has the capacity to not only depict a thing that is gone, but to give us a process for looking for it.
I'm moving to the ghostliness of hashtags and graffiti, which there's a way that we can envision that hashtags and social media kind of activism and graffiti are fairly ghostly, right? They kind of appear at night and then they're erased and then they're documented, and it's hard to document, you know, actually these viral movements that are happening. And I'm not actually really talking about any of those kind of ghostly aspects of social media and hashtags. But what I am talking about is ghost stories of what makes a mournable victim, which leads into a discourse of justice and a kind of Judith Butler sense of precarious lives and who is mournable and who's a worthy victim. There are also Mexican activists that are doing this from their philosophy and sociological construct of intersectional victims of gender violence and who actually has access to justice and who is seen as a worthy victim. So, a little bit of a warning. I will not be discussing any kind of violent image, like in detail, any kind of violence, but I will be discussing the murder of women and gender violence, and everyone should take deep breaths and take breaks if they need it. But there will be no like descriptive in detail of these kind of violences. But some of these things are hard to hear. So I messed up this GIF, I'm sorry. It was supposed to go round and round. And so aside from the fact that I seem to have this insatiable, unending love of all things ghosts, I recently, we all kind of were talking about our connections. My grandfather died in December, and he was like 90, almost 95. And so I have a girlfriend who always insists to me that the reason why I'm interested in ghosts is because of the Petersen family funeral home in Main Street, Newton. And I've always said, I did not grow up in 6 Feet Under. That is not what this is about. And as she's been insisting to me about this, I have become more aware of maybe this is part of my legacy. Part of the legacy of being the granddaughter of the Petersen family funeral home is the effective resonance of stories of those of who are no longer present with us. Like this was my grandpa with his Oklahoma accent who would say, Freddie, who was my dad, do you remember Mr. So-and-so? Well, they died last year. And he would tell me the story when we were little. And then my dad actually works there now too. And so there is this effective resonance of those who are gone and of honoring those who've passed and what is important to tell about their stories. In this project, I'm really looking about things that have been historically silenced, things that have been historically taboo, things that have been not seen as items that can be sought justice for. And in particular, when we're talking about Mexico, when we're talking about gender violence, this is something that is quite explosive. So if we're talking about, the statistics are really difficult to have precisely, but there are some estimates, and I think this was from the Human Rights Commission, that roughly in 2019, there have been not quite 1,200 murders of women in Mexico this year. The next highest country in Latin America, which this is a problem in Latin America, is Guatemala, and their numbers are about 360. so far in 2019, and that was roughly in August. So just to give an idea of kind of the magnitude of this, and yes, Mexico is a country like many other Latin American countries that deal with violence, but there is something about the particularity of the murder of women and of femicide. So this is the meme that I started our conversation with, and the translation is, "You'll never have the comfort of our silence again." So a lot of the images that you're seeing are part of a collection of photography and images that I did. Most of them are mine. There's a colleague in particular who's a grad student at WashU who is working on this project as well in some ways and in different aspects, so we've been collaborating. But this, so I basically kind of, my job was to walk around and take pictures of graffiti that had to do with gender violence and femicide, and this one is defining what femicide is. So it says, a hate crime that consists of the murder of women because she's a woman. And I would add to that definition that if we were to talk about actual definitions of femicide or feminicide, I say feminicide because the sociologists who are working on this in Mexico prefer the extra syllable in there because they look at femicide not as just literally the murder of women, but a systematic, institutional, societal-wide conditions that allow for gender violence to continue and for the murder of women to go without justice. That is not to say that other murderers receive justice either, but at one point when the murders were really concentrated on the border in Ciudad Juarez, which is on the southern side of El Paso, it was estimated that 95% of all femicide cases went unsolved and didn't even go to court. So, in my discussion of this, I'm talking and losing my place. But, so I'm really interested in what these graffitis and these public kind of displays that are trying to change what the cultural script of gender violence is. So this is actually like a drag theater bar that is run by a group of very feminist, bandit women. But in the bathroom, in the women's bathroom, you go in and they have the violence scale. And what is this actually teaching? It is educating that the scale of violence is not just about assassination or murder, but rather starts with jokes and teasing and catcalls and goes down in a progressive manner. So I'm really fascinated by this collective conversation that's happening, that's breaking silences, and that's using public discourse in lots of different ways to change how we view gendered violence. So let me talk just a little bit about how I see silencing of gendered violence as more of a ghostly type of discourse. So I really am looking at things that appear ghostly because they have either been silenced or suppressed in the past. So we're not talking about literal ghosts, but these are things that implement the ghostly as a means to bring to light that which has either been silenced or unspoken, that which has been unarticulated and which has been absent. So one of the people that I use to talk about this is Rebecca Solnit. She is a journalist, and she says that silencing or refusing to hear breaks this social contract of recognizing another's humanity and our connectedness. And I have, I think this one isn't translated, but most of these graffitis are translated. This is Vivas nos queremos. It's alive, we want ourselves, or we want to be alive. To continue with the ghostly, so the ghostly is about revealing what has been silenced. And so sometimes this is through impunity, through the normalization of violence. And it hosts, in breaking the silence kind of highlights the ghostly nature of these stories. So when we're talking about ghosts, you kind of have to mention Avery Gordon. She talks about how the ghost can reveal that which has been erased by hegemonic discourse. In our book, in Spectros, we talk about how the ghostly can counter erasure and silence. And in fact, one of those examples that were just given about photographs of the disappeared, the desaparecidos in Argentina is one of the things that we talk about in terms of a spectral moment, because these are people who have never been registered even as having been missing or been gone, and to bring the photograph into a protest is a spectral moment that brings to light that which has been erased, often institutionally and forcibly erased. And then finally, Blanco and Perrin talk about how the gender and the positionality of the specter matters. So intersectionally, I put gender there, but intersectionally, when we're talking about ghosts as subjectivities, all of their intersectionality matters. So when I look at this, I am weaving together all of these things, and I'm talking about how ghosts can be a conceptual metaphor to affect revisions of history and or reimaginations of the future in order to expose and address the way that certain subjectivities can never be erased. So for me, in the current Mexican context, to bring to the fore gender violence and graffiti, hashtag campaigns, and short fictions is to implement a spectral aesthetic that forces us to attend to the spectral and ghostly silences. These discourses, or this entire argument lies on the belief that that which is erased can never be fully erased, that there are specters that reveal themselves to us. So I'm not going to talk about this in depth, but I want to just show you that I'm talking about two things that happened in 2017 and 2019. So late fall, I think it was October, Me Too in the US exploded, but I just want you to see that this is starting in 1993, 1995, 2015 is the first kind of explosion of hashtags in Argentina that spreads all throughout Spain and Latin America. And I'm talking in particular about two moments in the last 2 years, but it's important in an audience in the US to say Me Too US was not occurring in an isolation, and had lots of precursors in Latin America. So these things that I describe as spectral moments, much like the photographs of the mothers, of the desaparecidos, is a recognition of forced erasure. And these spectral aesthetics help us see that. It helps us see what's in between, what's not viewable. So the Ni Una Menos is the most, it's probably like the umbrella hashtag of the movement against gender violence. And Judith Butler this summer wrote an article in the New York Times about her perspective on the Ni Una Menos versus the Me Too. I don't entirely agree with her, but she does have somewhat of a point. So her idea that Ni Una Menos is part of a constellation of activisms and resistance that includes abortion rights, movements against femicide, all sorts of things, where Me Too is an individual type movement. It's kind of a curious, it could be debated. I tend to agree with her, but I just kind of want to point that out in terms of the difference. So the first hashtag movement that I really examine is the Si Me Matan, and it's if they kill me. And what this really is it's a symbolic discursive gesture that forces you as the reader to put yourself in the situation of imagining the person you're engaging with in social media to be killed. So you guys, some of you guys actually know me, some of you guys don't. But imagine if I come to you and say, if they kill me, it's because I was out at 2 o'clock in the morning drinking beer. It becomes a lot more difficult to tell me that I'm an unworthy victim and that rhetoric gesture, right? So this all started in 2016 when a university student, Lesbi Berlin Osorio, was found on her former campus. She was about 21 years old, and the rector of the university said precisely that. She no longer was a student here, she had drug in her system. Basically, the same old victim blaming of good girls aren't in this situation, right? Recently, actually just last week, this was one of the very few femicide cases that I've ever seen actually have a verdict. Her boyfriend was convicted of murdering her, and he was sent to jail for 45 years, which is one of the very few cases that I've ever heard of that. which is also very important for us to realize because this is a student who, she didn't finish college, but she had a certain level of status that she went to university, she was recognized and well known, and she had a mother who went out, not too different from what happened with the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, a mother who worked tirelessly to bring her daughter's boyfriend and killer to justice. One of the most spectral moments that I have seen in my research is when about 5 months after that Si Me Matan campaign exploded, it exploded again, and it was because a 19-year-old girl was out at 5 a.m. and she got picked up by a Cabify, which is like an Uber, and you guys can imagine what happened. The rector of the university, which was adjacent to the university I studied at when I was an undergraduate, said she shouldn't have been out at 5 a.m., right? And it exploded again. But here we have this, and Mara, Mara Castilla, who is the person in Puebla who was murdered, this is her tweet, the tweet that she did in April, 5 months before she was murdered. If they kill me, it's because I like to go out at night and drink lots of beer. Okay. So one of the labs that is studying these hashtags, they have this great visualization when these things explode, and they kind of talk about all of the different hashtags that are going. It wasn't your fault. Justice for Mara Castilla, not one less, not one more. I am Mara. Alerta, so alert for Mexican women. All of these kind of hashtags, a constellation of hashtags. And the caption on this I thought was really moving. It was a hashtag Mara Castillo, an open wound in a country that accumulates tragedies, but also critical ways of mobilizing activism. And so those mobilizing activisms and these spectral moments is really what I'm looking at in this. So, a lot of this, my fascination with this is that it's people are looking for ways to make countable victims. Who can be worthy victims? So 2 pieces of graffiti that I found this summer were especially poignant in this. So we have the Catrina, who is an icon of all of the Mexican national imaginary. No one would not know who she is, and with the tag Ni Una Menos. So and you shouldn't miss, by the way, a plug, the Posadas exhibit that's coming next week, right? Here in the Humanities Center, and this is the original image of the Catrina. There are gazillions of variations of her here, but this one was one particular, and this is kind of like, I don't know, the North Park of Mexico City. It's like the hipster hood. And it was on the wall that was the Catrina as also not one more. So this is a way of saying, if the Catrina can be a victim, then she can be a worthy one. Now, this is also a very poignant one, the worthiest of all victims. So here we have the Virgin of Guadalupe, called, like, the names are endless for what she is, the Emperor of the Americas, the Goddess of the Americas. She is hugely important in the Mexican national imaginary and throughout Latin America and throughout the US in terms of a subversive virgin for all sorts of different reasons. So in this graffiti, we have her kind of with the death mask on, and the caption is, well, it's also a really fascinating wall, right? It has like the Mexico, the assassination state, and then it also has, I am no longer here, even though I am your mother, I am one of the 9 women murdered in Mexico every day, right? And this is just adjacent to the Centro Histórico of here. And this again is that same discursive gesture, is if the Virgin of Guadalupe can be a victim of femicide, then how could you discount me? Oops, I went away. So we're out of time. I won't talk about Me Too Mexico. I'm happy to talk about it after. But what I do want to talk to you about is the last kind of 2 things are anti-monuments. So this is actually a monument that's an anti-monument. It's front of Bellas Artes, which is the art center of Mexico City. And this was a rogue monument that was put up, and it says, In Mexico, 9 women are assassinated on a daily basis, and on the other side, we demand a nationwide gender violence alert. It's debatable how well those alerts actually work, but that's another point. But their entire, and there are a couple actual national tragedies that they used and used anti-monuments for, and it was these rogue kind of things. And what this organizer said was, I want people to see what they should be paying attention to when they walk through the streets, right? So the things that they can choose to ignore, but by putting these anti-monuments here, it makes the invisible visible. So in August, there was another big wave. One of the difficulties of studying this topic is every 3 months, it seems, is about the rate of when something explodes. So there was women who went to the police and then said that the police raped them. And so there was a huge protest, as you might imagine. And it started a new hashtag of no me cuida la policía, me cuidan mis amigas, the police don't take care of me, my friends do. There was a glitter activism is what it was. There was pink glitter in all of the protests, pink paint everywhere. There was some vandalism that happened. The door of the police, the main police, whatever word that I'm looking for, in Mexico City was broken. And as you might be surprised, as it might not be surprising, a lot of the news said, this vandalism is unacceptable. We can't possibly imagine why someone would justify the vandalism of a police station or of a national monument. Most of the mainstream media, did not put into the context the realities of gender violence in Mexico, in Mexico City, or in the entire nation right now. So a lot of really interesting activists and studies on public spaces are being done right now. There's one by an architect in Mexico who said, what more is a national monument but a space in which we can make memories of what is going on and what needs to be remembered. And so I am interpreting this kind of dramatic graffiti to the Angel of Independence, which is, in their defense, is also precisely where every protest that's ever in the history of Mexico City, it always ends here. And it usually ends with some vandalism. Not quite that much, but it's very poignant, right? So we have here a femicide state in Mexico, and it has a lot of things like down with we're going to burn the patriarchy, femicide state, down with rape, but there are lots of symbols on here. So my interpretation of these kind of movements are that they're really spectral moments that are forcing the public and us to look at what they need to pay attention to in ways that breaks with the hegemonic discourse of monuments, of official justice, and hopefully moves towards more justice as well. But I'll wrap up there. Okay, thanks.
Is there any reflection or comment or question anyone would like to make? And then we can always talk after the rest of you have headed off. Yeah.
I had a question, maybe specifically for Megan, but also Professor Clack. It seems to me that ghosts are always these mobile entities, these fleeting, moving figures, returning figures, but they have this very special relationship with still photography that they don't have with, say, video. And obviously there's a lot of medium specificity, but I was wondering if you would say something about the way the temporality of the still photograph and the moving spirit sort of intersect.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's a good question. I think the moment, the fact of the still photographs identification with a moment that has gone. Even when an exposure is 20 seconds long, even when an exposure is 20 minutes long, in fact, that might benefit the creation of a ghost in a photograph to have a long exposure. But even so, it's a very limited durational event, an artifact of that event, that I think lends itself metaphorically to this kind of psychosocial relationship we have with it around its kind of harboring of something that we cannot get back. Whereas the film mirrors a different part of our narrativizing of our existence. You can tell a story with an arc, which doesn't necessarily suggest itself to something that you just reach out and can't find. I think death is itself a moment. If anyone who's ever been present at one, even more so than birth, death is, for even the most secular among us, a moment at which you clearly see a separation between a body and a life force. It's gone. Whereas hopefully a baby arrives as one. So everything about death, I think, or loss, whether it's death or simply having been forced to move or having kind of lost something, suggests itself for that moment of separation. I'm making this up, but this would be my my feeling, my instinct around that. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm interested in recently I come across bits of film that appear on the news from time to time on my phone when I look at my news feed in this. So there's an extraordinary piece of footage from I suppose in terms of baby cam. There's a baby in a, I don't think you saw this thing, there's a baby in its cot, and it sort of does this, and then you see this sort of floating form going past it. There's a couple of things to say. That one is that you do have like the movie, and of course there's so many TV shows that are based upon tracking the orbs as they go around the thing. But what's really interesting is how these things capture our imagination still. It seems like we are drawn very, very much to, well, I think not so much photos now. I think it is actually in the footage, because we're on camera all the time. We're constantly monitoring our houses and our nurseries, and then we trawl back over this stuff and something odd comes across and people get kind of magnetized by it.
And I think we still live in that moment of we want to put the label on it, and we want it to be true or not, or exist or not. And I think that it's not I think we're kind of, I'm sure it's not just me that is fascinated by those kind of baby cam, that the ghost appears, but also I can think of 5 movies, horror films that have come out just in Hollywood in the last 5 months that are really negotiating ghosts, and sometimes they're doing it, in my opinion, in a way that's really fascinating, and sometimes it's more kind of a Hollywood production, but there are hundreds of movies that are coming out each year that are obsessed with this notion of, and I think it also has to do with a lot of the affective resonance, right? Of how do we grapple with that which we don't know, and our fear of the inevitable, and we're grappling with this in our lives all the time.
But I think the difference may be, I could suggest a difference between filmic or narrativized ghost stories. You mentioned, you mentioned ghost stories, and films, certainly there are a lot of them, but what they do is maybe functioning more on an Aristotelian kind of cathartic level of suggesting, ways to move through these experiences. Whereas the photograph serves as this kind of one-to-one representation of our actual experience of memory. And it's something that you're left to contend with. When someone dies, sure, you can sit there and watch home movies and have experiences with it. But if you are Roland Barthes, when he looks at those pictures of his mother, he's kind of performing the act of looking, and it has to happen one by one, and it has to involve this kind of disappointment and rejection of each one, and then a final recognition. And there she is, kind of a ghost. In a movie, you have the story arc that moves you through the fear and the mounting experience, and then leaves you societally prepared again to participate. It could. Right.
I'm interested in your question. Do you want to say a word about what provoked you to ask that?
Well, I thought it was you know, there are sometimes these graves that have video embedded in them. There are sometimes people who keep sort of clips of family members in this way, but we don't keep them in the same way as we could photographs. And when the cameras, especially in the 19th century, are capturing these ghosts, capturing things like ectoplasm, it seems like they're seeing something beyond. It's a kind of mechanical sight that exceeds the human eye. And even when that becomes motion, it seems like that capacity gets lost. And there are, you know, the floating orbs, but they don't work in the same way. They don't have the same currency that they did when they were still photographs.
There are, in fact, there's one of the Japanese versions of the spirit photograph is actually about thought recordings. So it's not about a spirit, it's about a thought. And I think that maybe provides a little insight into the still photographs relationship there, because it is Descartian. It is the question of what is outside of my body. How do I know if anything is real? So I think therefore I can show you. You know, there are my thoughts. Of course, that was debunked as well, but but yeah, I think we're all just thinking about how to prove that we exist and that our perspective exists.
Well, we should, I know you have responsibilities in the classroom, so we should stop it here.